Good morning. Today I will record the shield I gave on Shabbos yesterday, Parshas Haatzmaut Kedoshim, as it was the week of Yom Haatzmaut. I thought that it was an opportunity to review the hesped that Harav Kook has given on Dr. Binyamin Herzl. So on the passing of Theodore Herzl, Harav Kook wrote, I don't know if he gave it, I don't know if he spoke about it, but he wrote, in any case, a kind of a hesped. As we shall see, it is not really going about the person himself, but more about the movement that Dr. Herzl actually he started off, and he went into that path. So he wants to explain that. So he starts off with a very interesting pshat in the Gemara in Megillah. It says in the Gemara Megillah that there is a posuk Vayomahu Itala Mispet Yerushalayim Ke Mispet Hadadrimoin Bevikas Megiddoin. So on that day, we don't know what is that day, but on the particular day there will be a very big hesped, a very big eulogy, kind of an eulogy, like the eulogy of Dadrimoin Bevikas Megiddoin. And nobody understands what this posuk means, because there is no really a case that has been described before that it was in Adadrimon Bevikas Megiddoin. So Herzl explained that Yonis ben Uziel, he translated the Nevi'im, like Onkelos translated the Chumash, Yonis ben Uziel did the Nevi'im, and when he did that, the Eretz Yisrael started to shake a lot, and because he explained things that should not be explained. So certain psukim should remain hidden and not be understood, but Yonis ben Uziel, he started to translate it as it was. And then the Gemara continues that at some point Yonis ben Uziel had to stand up and say that he said, Mish Omar Oilom, Mish Omar Oilom, Sisi, I didn't do it for myself, and not for the covet and the honor for my father, in order to remove machloekes between Klal Yisrael. And that's a very interesting concept. So the question is, of course, what did he tell us? So Rav Yosef says in the Gemara, if not for his translation, wouldn't know what it means. And then what is the Gilui? What was he revealing that was so special? So what is this mispet that already existed in the time? Mispet achov the kotal yasi hadadrimoin. That it will be, actually it means, and that's very important, it's going to be a hesped, an eulogy, like two different kind of eulogies. So it's going to be kind of one eulogy that it will be like two different eulogies. So when it says kemispet hadadrimoin, then this is the kemispet achov the kotal yasi hadadrimoin. So it's actually referring to two different historical points, tragedies that happened. On the one hand, it was Achov that got killed, and on the other hand, it was Yoshio that was killed. And those two different types of eulogies will be done as well on Be'oi Mahu, on that day in Yerushalayim. So the Gemara explains, in the Gemara in Sukkah actually, explains that Be'oi Mahu is Moshiach ben Yosef. Then when Moshiach ben Yosef will come, the Gemara in Sukkah has his opinion. We know already that the Rambam doesn't mention at all the Moshiach ben Yosef, but at least in the Gemara, the Chazal, we have a Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David. And so the Gemara explains in Sukkah that this posuk refers to Moshiach ben Yosef, that there will be a hesped when Moshiach ben Yosef will die, when he will be killed. And so be'etzem, we need to understand what is the secret that there will be a hesped, what does it mean, why does it remove machloekes in Israel if we learn it like that. So the first question that he asks, Rav Kook, is why do we need two Mashiach? Be'etzem, we only need one Mashiach. David, it says in the Posuk, David avdi nosi lohem lo'olam. It says in the Posuk clearly that on all the kingdoms that the Jews will have, David will become the Nosi of all of them, will be the president of all of them. So why do we need two Mashiach? Why do we need two Mashiach? And so he answers that in essence, like we have a neshama and we have a guf, like we have a soul and a body, meaning that the soul needs the body to live and to develop himself, but also the body needs a neshama to live. Without a neshama, there's no life. But in order to live, he needs to eat and have what we call a gashmius, or what Rav Kook calls the chomriut. Chomriut meaning the material needs that we have, and the neshama has spiritual needs. And they both need each other. You cannot live without the body, you cannot live without the neshama, and each one of them has to help each other in order to develop itself, so that eventually, of course, the neshama is the one that is at the lead and has the purpose is the soul, is what the purpose is all about, the spirituality, develop spirituality, but it's also important the body is healthy. This is one of the points of Rav Kook very much. So you need to actually have both. And in other words, he claims that the Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David plays a role like the body and like the soul. Like the Moshiach ben Yosef will be the one that will bring us the material geula, material salvation, and the Moshiach ben David will bring us the geula that will be spiritual. But then he says something very interesting, and he says that there is in the Psukim, as he's very much into the concept that Jewish people, Judaism is not a religion, but it's actually a nationality. In other words, it's about to be a nation. And on that part, there is something very interesting. There is a contradiction in the Psukim, in the Novi. On one hand, he says that we have to be a goy echod ba'oretz, we have to be a nation like the other nations, le'oir goyim, that's another posuk, that says that we have to be the light of the other nations. In other words, we have to be open to the other nations, we have to communicate with the other nations. So in other words, we have to behave like a normal nation, being a nation amongst the nation, and on the other hand, we have to be the light of the other nation. On the other hand, we see that the Torah also describes our nation as Hashem bodot yanchen. Hashem will put us separated from the other nations. Uvagoyim lo yischashov. It's another pasuk which says that we will not be counted amongst the other nations. In other words, you could say you have 70 nations. Well, the Jewish nation is not part of the 70 nations because it's got a different status, a different definition. And so here we have two contradictions. On one hand, we are a nation amongst the other nations, and what you can also take from the Psukim, Goy Mikerev Goy. We are a nation that was born from within another nation. And on the other hand, it says that will be something special, something different, not necessarily better in all the different senses, but will be another definition. It's not going to be a nation like the other nations. And so how do we, can we combine those two into one? And so he explains that those are two different forces that will always exist in the Jewish nation. There is one force that has a role to actually create and to push us to create a nation amongst the other nations. And on the other hand, we have another force that will try to make us, that will give us the specificity that we will have that will not be comparable at all with the other nations. And these are the two forces, is what is between Ephraim and Yehuda, or between Yosef and Yehuda. He says that, and that's a very important part of him, but also what Manitou will use a lot later, is Maaseh Ovois Simon Abonim. So since, what does it mean? That whatever happened to our forefathers will also happen to us. So all the stories that you see in Sefer Bereshis will actually happen as well to the children and the whole generation that will follow. This is called Maaseh Ovois Simon Abonim. The stories of the parents will be siman, will be a sign for the children. In other words, they should learn it so that they can recognize what is going on in their own historical perspective. And you see indeed that Yosef himself was somebody that looked after the material needs of a person, and because it says that Yosef was a mashbir. Mashbir is somebody that brings food. And he actually, to actually save a lot of people from hunger, to give a lot of food for a lot of different people. In other words, he is here for the material needs, but also, and that's very important, he is also very open to the other nations. He tells Paroi, says the Gemara, he tells Paroi that if he makes him the leader, the vice president, if you call it like that, he will actually be able to serve and to influence all the nations of the world. The Gemara explains that in order to do that, he had to learn 70 languages, and the Malach Gabriel, he came down and in one night and he taught him 70 languages. Suddenly he knew how to speak 70 languages. So basically he became also open to the outside world. So in other words, this is what he described before. Yosef represents that force that tries to make us into a nation like the other nations. And Yehuda, on the other hand, is the force that tries to give us this particularity that we have versus the universality from Yosef. Universality means we have to be open to the other nations as well. There's a famous philosophical discussion of whether the Torah and Tarek Mitzvahs is particular, is a part of the particularity of the Jewish people, or is it something which is universal, has to teach to the other nations as well in order to be what we call the Ohr LaGoyim. The Ohr LaGoyim is the universality of the Jewish people, and the Goy Kodosh Mamleches Koyanim is the particularity of the Jewish people, to keep ourselves with a Kedusha so that we are not Yisrashov B'Toich HaGoyim. This is what HaGoyim Lo Yisrashov. So these are two forces that are actually contradicting each other, but actually when, as Manitou explained, typically kingdoms, but also B'Tei Mikdosh, always start from Yosef, because first you put the basics as to be that we have food, that we have some materialist, that we are answered by our materialistic needs, and then you have the Yehuda that brings us the Kedusha, so that we can put on top of it the Kedusha, the particularity. And this is what was with Shaul. Shaul was from Yosef, of course, and from Rochel in any case, what we call Rochel, the Bnei Rochel, and on the other hand, David HaMelech was from Yehuda. But, says Rav Kook, David HaMelech had something very interesting, very important. He had also that when Shmuel, the Medrash explains that, when Shmuel saw David HaMelech, he saw in him an Admoini. An Admoini is the same adjective that is also given to Esau. In translation, it would mean a red-haired person. But what it means is, the Chazal explained, it means that he saw in him a murderer, somebody that likes killing. And this is something which he was shocked. So Shmuel HaNovi did not understand. He was going to choose David HaMelech, but he realized that he is somebody that is a killer, has a killing instinct, similar to what Esau was. And that's why Esau was also called an Admoini. So it was the same adjective that he received. And but then he saw that he was Yefei Einayim. He had beautiful eyes. What does it mean, beautiful eyes? That says Chazal, Umidas Sanedrin. In other words, he's not just a killer because he follows his instinct, but he first asked permission to the Sanhedrin if he is allowed to kill. And that's why you see here that you have the two forces, Yosef and Yehuda, and then the David HaMelech, that is an Admoini, which is like a Yosef. He comes from Yehuda, but he is also like a Yosef, that is also looking for the materialistic needs. But on the other hand, he is also a Einayim. He follows the Sanhedrin, which is in Yehuda. And so basically, the similarity is very, very clear to Esau. The Gemara, and he brings on also, that it is only a Bnei Rochel that can fight with Esau. Because he brings down that that's like we say, Mineu Bey Abo Nezal Bey Narga. So that the wood is cut by something that has a wood on it. So you need the same material in order to fight that material. And therefore, it's also said David HaMelech, of course, as well, had an obligation to fight with Amalek. But originally, the plan was that it should be only one wood that would lead Klal Yisrael, and this is the wood of Eitz Yehuda. So, of course, this plan did not work out. After David HaMelech came Shlomo HaMelech. It was then the Beis HaMikdash was built, but eventually, because of the Averes, says Rav Kook, for some reason this plan did not work, and the two kingdoms started to separate. Those two forces that were able to be kept together because David HaMelech had those two together, but after the sins of Klal Yisrael, the two forces separated and said that they cannot live anymore with each other. And they both developed into their own development. So they did not work with each other, but they all separately, independently developed. And that created a problem. Of course, Ephraim, we know, became a big problem, and they started to do Avodah Zorah, and they had all kind of terrible things that they developed. The Ephraim, Boamim, who is Boilot, Ephraim is indeed try to emulate the Goyim and try to emulate the other nations, and therefore he is Boilot. Bololut in modern Hebrew means assimilation, try to assimilate with other nations. Ephraim, hoyo uko beli afuch. In other words, something not very nice. Ephraim turned into something horrible, but not only Ephraim, and that's the whole point from Rav Kook, also Yehuda, which focused on Kedusha, but did not focus on the Chomriyut and the Klolit. Klolit means the universality, was Koshal Gam Yehuda, that Yehuda also started to go in the wrong direction, it says in the Pasuk. And because those two, as long as they are not working together, then it cannot work. So theoretically, ideally, they should be one. There should not be two forces. They should always work as one, where the two forces are internal in the nation. But if this doesn't work, then they separate. But eventually, what Rav Kook says, they should at least talk to each other. So what the one is missing should be then compensated by the other. The other one should communicate and give to the other what the other one is missing, and vice versa. So when the Chomriyut is missing from Yehuda, then they should ask to Yosef, how do you make sure that we have a good nation with a good economy and a good defense system, and etc., the international relations, etc. And on the other hand, when Yosef feels that he's missing in spirituality, he should ask Yehuda, how can I add my spirituality? How can I add more Torah and Ruach HaKodesh and Nuvu, etc. So this is actually what they both should be working for. If they would have worked together, says Rav Kook, then this split would actually slowly heal, and they could eventually live together side by side. But it has not happened, and this is clearly represented in Chazal, in the story that the Rebbeinu Shalom came to Yerovam. The Yerovam was the first to have split up, and he came to Yerovam, and he said, why don't you make tshuva and come and we'll walk, all three of us, in the Gan Eden. You with Beis David, with Ben David, and also with me and myself. We'll walk as three people together. In other words, I don't need you to give up the kingdom. I just want you to do tshuva. I don't mind you to live separate from Yehuda. I understand that you don't like them, you don't find them sympathetic, as many to explain it, but still, just create we can live in what we can call a confederation. We can have two kingdoms that is confederated into one big country. And so the question, of course, was from Yerovam, it's very good, maybe yes, but who is going to be on the lead? Who is going to be in the front? And so the Rebbeinu Shalom answered him, it's going to be David HaMelech, as we said before, that the Nasi, of course, will be only David HaMelech. And so when Yerovam heard that it's going to be only David HaMelech, then he said, Im kein loy beino. So Yochi loy beino, I don't want. And it is this akshonus that Yerovam had that actually was the start of the Golus and the Tzoros that Klal Yisrael had because of the machloekes, internal machloekes. Since then, things never healed, and there will always be kind of two different forces that will actually start to develop. So sometimes the forces of nationalism, like Yosef, will start to develop in the Jewish nation. Probably what he means, Rav Kook, is in the time of the Hashmonaim and in the time of the Maccabeim. And so therefore, or in the time from Bar Kokhba, sorry. These are all times when Klal Yisrael suddenly had an awakening of wanting to go back and develop our own nation, nationalism and universality. And sometimes we have time when we are focused only on Torah and on mitzvahs, and we forget about nationalism and our universal role that we have to play to be the Or LaGoyim. And basically what he says, that this is the role of Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben Moshiach ben Yosef has to actually instill in us suddenly, when its time is right, to instill in us a nationalistic a feeling of wanting to go and to create our own nation. This is the role of Moshiach ben Yosef, and Moshiach ben David is the role that comes later, is once this nation has been built, then we can start adding on the Kedusha and making sure that we are a Goy Kodesh Mamleches Kohanim. And so he explains that when this will happen, when suddenly there is an increase in one force and then will hopefully be followed by another force, that will create essentially kind of a regret. In other words, when suddenly Moshiach ben Yosef will develop, and so in other words, the Meshichut of Yosef will develop. In other words, we will become first a nation. There is a big danger that obviously we will forget that we also have to add Kedusha, and we will develop it in so much that we will forget about the particularity that as a Jewish nation we have to be. We will only think of creating a nation amongst the other nations, but also to include the universality. We will start talking with the nations, we'll start teaching the nations. We are the startup country. We invented the cherry tomatoes and all kind of other fruits and etc. All the technology that we are trying to teach and help the humanity to prosper and to fight diseases, etc. But we forget that the Or LaGoyim means also spirituality, and that we need to increase the spirituality after that phase. And if it is not going to happen, then it's of course there will be something bad that will happen. This is called the Moshiach ben Yosef that will be killed. So it's something, a tragedy that will happen, and there will be a hesped. A hesped is an eulogy. So he explains it's not an eulogy of somebody that died, but it is kind of an eulogy that a regret, we should have done something else. And because we have not done that, we are now in where we are. So it's a realization of a mistake that we have done, that we have erred in our doings in before. And this is the hesped that we are going to feel. Why is that the hesped? So what is this hesped in any case? What is this hesped? The hesped is eulogy, and these regrets that we are going to feel will be the same regret as actually there was a story with Achov and the eulogy towards Yeshio. In other words, it's not that we will regret double, but actually there will be the two forces in the Jewish nation will start to regret and to realize that they've made a big mistake. Why? Because what happened to Achov? Achov was a king that had a tremendous love of Eretz Yisrael. He was extremely nationalistic. He really he developed cities like his father, who added more cities to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the adding of a city in the Nach means that he loved the land very, very much. And therefore, this love of the land translated himself into what we can call a very strong nationalistic ideology. So much that he loved the nation that even when he was fighting against the enemy, even after he got some arrows in his body, knowing that he's going to die, his love, basically his adrenaline, triggered by his love for the land and not to fall, that Israel should not fall into despair and losing a war, he fought further a long time after the arrows were already in his body, says in the Pasuk. In other words, this is something extraordinary in terms of love for the land. And so, of course, instead of focusing too much on being a universal nation like the other nations, he should not have listened to his wife Isabel and who actually pushed him in order to do horrible things and to bring the nation as in fully serving Avodah Zorah. On the other hand, you have Yoshio. Yoshio says the Posuk in Novi that there was never a king that was so religious, that brought such a lot of religiosity in his country, in the Malchus Yehuda, as Yoshio. So he started to remove all the Avodah Zorah that happened even in Malchus Yehuda, and he managed to restarted the Beis Hamikdash. And the first time that, after a long time, that they have not done a Korban Pesach like they've done it at that time. So this is a fantastic religious king that does everything right. And then afterwards he gets killed by Paro, by a king of Egypt. And the question is, why did he get killed? In Novi, it's not very clear, but the Meforshim explain is because Paro, at the time, the king of Egypt, asked him that to pass through Eretz Yisrael in order to be able to go to the battlefield with Ashur. Egypt and Ashur decided they're going to fight a war, and the battlefield would have been up in the north of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the army had to pass Eretz Yisrael. And they asked permission and said to Yoshio, don't worry, I'm not going to go through your land. I'm going to go through your land, but I'm not going to fight with you. I am not here with you. I don't have a problem with you. I have a problem with Ashur. And so it says in the Meforshim that Yirmiyahu actually told him, to Yoshio, that it's okay. As a Novi, I tell you, you can let Paro pass. It's not a problem. But Yoshio thought differently, and he learned it from the Posuk that one should not let any armies go through the land. He misread it, apparently, because he did not listen to the Novi, and in other words, he decided he's not going to let Paro come into Eretz Yisrael, and he started a war against him, and he was killed by Paro. And so that is a big tragedy that happened. And here again, we see the opposite. We see somebody that is so religious that wants to protect and close off Eretz Yisrael from the outside world, does not want to play the Or LaGoyim, does not want to play a service to give to the other nations, but closes his off because he's afraid that the other nations, if we come in contact with them, will actually decrease the religiosity of the nation. And for this, he's been killed, he's been punished. And there was a big eulogy after he was killed. So we have here the two forces that actually had already in the past realization that what they're doing is wrong. On the one hand, the one that think of nationalism and universality and materialism, that which is good, but if it goes hand in hand together with spirituality and kedusha, then it will not end up well, like Achov. On the other hand, too much religiosity, and where you close yourself up completely without having any interaction with the outside world, which is your role, basically, the Or LaGoyim, and you have to also be a little bit more universal to be able to, and also a little bit more materialism. You have to work for the materialism. This also doesn't end very well, as the story will show. And when those two stories will happen, in other words, when we will eventually see the Moshiach, and it will be a balagan, a revuvia, this is what he calls the Chevle de Moshiach. In that case, Klal Yisrael will suddenly, after a certain crisis, realize the Achovs of this world and the Yoshio of this world. They will realize that they've made a mistake by not talking to each other and helping each other and looking what I'm missing, what can he help me to be mashlim, what I'm missing, my chesoron, and vice versa. He says also something very interesting, which I don't think that he means it in what I'm going to say now, but there's a word, play of words, which is, if there is no chomriut, like when Yehuda is in a time when there is no development of economy and logistic and etc., then what happens is, of course, we are falling into poverty, and the poverty creates a depression and a darkness and a sadness. There is also another reason why he claims that the Haredi world is a very depressed world and a dark and a depressing world, is because the Haredi world has too much focus on one particular thing and doesn't allow the people to be their individual needs and individual developments and their talents. There is too much of a one-size-fits-all for all the bochrim in the yeshiva. They all have to be ki ish echod belev echod. This concept is pushed in such a level that the individuality is being crushed and the people feel like they are choked, even if they don't believe it themselves, but the subconsciousness tells them that they could have done so much more other things, and they were pushed to in one simple direction in order to be evolved. But the play of words is when there is no chomriyut, when there is no the materialistic needs are not fulfilled. In that case, there started to be chumrius. In other words, where the chumras are starting to develop in our religion. And so this poverty and this lack of fulfillment and the fulfillment in materialistic need, but also the understanding that we play a geopolitical role in the world, this lacking of that element and always being closed on ourselves in order to compensate for our misfeelings, for our feelings of something is wrong, something is missing, and it's like pushing us, we respond to that with chumrus. Then we do even more chumrus. The more we lack chumriyut, the more that we compensate with chumriyut, with chumrus that we put upon ourselves. And therefore, he is actually explaining that if the two people will not develop and they will not discuss with each other and respect each other, live with each other without becoming necessarily one. Ideally, it would be that we become one, and internally these two forces should actually play with each other. But if we are not going to do that, then it's not going to end up very well. And so therefore he says, and this is, I think, the reference to Theodore Herzl, to the one that we could have counted, so he gives a reference to Benjamin, Dr. Benjamin Ze'ev Herzl. He gives him a kind of somebody that walked in the footsteps of Moshiach ben Yosef. It's a very nice way to explain that at least he walks in that footsteps. In other words, he brought the nationalism in Eretz Yisrael, and because he's the one that actually started this off and picked up and started to organize, and it ended up in what we know today, the Jewish state of Israel. But he calls it Betor, the ones that goes in the Ikvel of Moshiach ben Yosef, the ones that goes in the footsteps of Moshiach ben Yosef. He does not call him necessarily Moshiach ben Yosef, but he says that he is the one that walks in the footsteps of Moshiach ben Yosef. But he says that this is something very important, that he has to realize that if this movement is going to continue in becoming what he calls mamish tsar and oyev to the Torah, then they're becoming the enemies of the Torah. This cannot end up very well. And so therefore he says, in order for us to be able to put the two, as the Novi says, and the Novi Yecheskel, and we're reading it in our Torah, when he says, take a stick, put on it the word Yehuda, and take another stick and write on it Yosef Eitz Ephraim, and bring them closer together. It should become one stick of wood, and they should be as one in your hands. And that means, in other words, I don't really necessarily need it to be one stone, one stick, which has on one side Yehud and the other side Yosef. I don't mind it to be two sticks, but hold it together, and it should become one stick as the one that will hold it, that Hashem will hold it as one stick. In other words, it has to be united, but not unified. It's a very important element that Rav Kook here is trying to give us. And this is, in that case, then of course it will be a successful. And then, but he says something very important. The Torah, the Novi says, continues in the whole element, because only then the Nosati is Migdoshi Besoichem le'olam, mishkoni alehem, and I will live amongst you. It's something very important. The Beis Hamikdash has actually two roles. On the one role that we know, it's to forgive our sins, that we can bring our korbanos in order to be forgiven our sins. On the other hand, it can also be a meeting place with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, where we hope to be able, when we can go and meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kind of, in his house, in his home, and therefore this is what is called the Mishkan from Hashem, where he's Shoichen. But there is very interesting that the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash that was in Shiloh, which was in Yosef, is the Osov in Tehillim calls it Ohel Shikein Be'odom, that it is Ohel that lives Be'odom, amongst the people. And Odom not amongst Israel, but amongst the Odom. Odom meaning that it's universal. So Yosef sees, when Yosef builds a Beit HaMikdash, like the Mishkan Shiloh, they see the role of Beit HaMikdash as a meeting place for all humanity. So all humanity can start meeting with God through the Kohanim, which are Israel, the Mamleches Kohanim for the nations, and of course through the Kohanim themselves, that will be the ones that will work inside of this house. But once it moves to Yehuda, then it becomes a place where we are lechaper al nafsho seichen, as we say in the Agudah Shel Pesach, v'nosanon es beis abchir lechaper al nafsho seinu or al avoinu seinu. So it becomes a place of forgiveness. We are sinners. While in Yehuda, they are not considered themselves as sinners, but they are human beings that want to meet with God. And then, if you will unify those two sticks together, v'nosati oisom olov, and I will put on top of them. So, in other words, I will lift up of them Eitz Yehuda. I will make sure that the Eitz Yehuda is a little bit higher. V'asisim le'eitz echod, and like this, I will create one stick. V'hoyu echod biodi, and those two will be as one in my hands. V'David avdi nosi lohem le'olam, and David HaMelech will be the ones that will be Nosi, will be the president over them. So basically, this is a very nice the kind of explanation of the whole story that we are experiencing today, where the left is extremely fighting with the right, with the religious people. They want to be oiker the Torah. They nearly say it openly. And on the other hand, we have the Haredi that are completely isolated from the whole nation, and they don't want to have to do anything with the Chilonim, with the people that are basically thinking of the land and of the universality. And so therefore there is absolutely no connection with each other. And sometimes it needs a crisis in order to put them both together. And I think that eventually, as it says in the Torah, Yosef recognized eventually the brothers, but the brothers, the brothers did not recognize Yosef, but eventually they did recognize him. And therefore, basically, there is the Mas over Simulabonim. They will both recognize and they will start crying to each other. And this is the hesped that Jonas Menuziel describes in the Posuk, that eventually both will realize that they made a mistake. They were too extreme in their both views, and they developed in such a way that it became impossible. They become completely irrational. I hear from both parties things that I cannot understand, even how it can come out from a logical and a normal person. I will just to end up with something which I liked very, very much from Manitou. So Manitou actually, he ends up and he says, Kefi anira, like I assume, like I can see, Anu Chayim Kayom et Tom HaMa'avar ben Tkufat Moshiach ben Yosef leTkufat Moshiach ben David. In other words, we live already at the end of the Tkufa between Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David. In other words, Moshiach ben Yosef kind of came already, and we are now starting to see the end, which is the Irvuv here, which is the whole, the Chevle Moshiach, which Rav Kook calls the Chevle Moshiach, is really this fight that will exist between Yosef and Yehuda, that will create a lot of anxiety and stress and unpleasantness in the whole story of the whole Geula. The fight, the inner fight, the war, brothers nearly, that existed between those two. And Rav Kook explains that very, very much. And he also explains that it's important for Rav Yosef, when Rav Yosef said in the Gemara that he wants to participate in the Chevle de Moshiach, meaning that he wants to try and bring light to specifically to the other side, the side that actually does not want to see anything to do with the Torah, does not understand why we need the Kiddush, why we need to be separate, particular as well as being universal, as well as being a nation like the other nations. If they don't understand this, try to understand in order to bring the Geula better to his close. So when we look at the details, says Manitou, everything is lost. The differences are so strong that they will never be reconciliated. Everything is already being able to come to a resolution. In order to be able to see that, we need also to have a Emunah Pshuta, mitzad haklal, from having the bigger picture. So when you look on the bigger picture, you see that the things are going in the right direction. Basically, even if there is, for example, the left, the Chilonim in Eretz Yisrael, they do not listen at all to the religious people, but you do see that there is absolutely hardly no government in the last tens of years that did not have religious parties also in them. Of course, not by choice, but whatever, doesn't make a difference. You do see that the religious parties are always part of the government. And you do see that more and more in the government, in the parliament, in the Knesset, there are psukim that are mentioned, and that our people are using the Torah in order to defend their case and in understanding in what they believe is ethics and should be politically correct. And so you do start to see already some kind of improvement. So the pratim, but when you look on the individuals and particular parties and people that are living in both communities, it seems like this is balagam, this is chaos, entropy, whatever you want to call it. We went very quick to where we are today. So he wrote this in probably the 90s, on the previous century, which means about 50 years before was the Second World War. When we think about where we come from the Second World War, when we had nothing, we lost everything, to where we are today, that we are fighting about existential problems, but these are luxury discussions, we have done already a lot of progress. And this is what we have to appreciate, and therefore we believe there is no doubt that we are going into the right direction. Eventually, both parties will regret and they will fall into each other's arms like the brothers did with Yosef. They both recognized each other, and may we be indeed merit that this moment will arrive, and that therefore the Moshiach ben Yosef can come and redeem us by bringing the Beis HaMikdash and the Kedusha into the Eretz Yisrael, so that we can play the role of to become the Oyer Lagoim, the light of the nations, so that they can see the difference between what is Toiv and Ra, good and bad, and between Emes and Sheker, between truth and untrue. May we reserve to that, B'meiro B'yomeinu Amen.